Welcome. Tonight we journey to the rugged coastline of Monte Cristo in the late 1930s, where ancient cliffs, windswept pines, and the echo of crashing waves hide more than just the secrets of the sea. Among the aristocratic villas and forgotten ruins, a gathering of distinguished guests turns into a scene of terror when an impossible crime shatters the illusion of safety. Stay with me until the very end, for this mystery reveals a web of deception so intricate that only the most delicate use of the little gray cells could unravel it. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoy these stories and the work I do here, please consider subscribing to the channel. You can also join our membership for ad-free videos and exclusive mysteries. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are listening from. Reading your comments always brings me joy. Now settle in with a hot cup of coffee, stay curious, and let us begin. The invitation arrived on a soft spring morning in 1938, when the air along the Tuscan coast carried both the scent of orange blossom and the faint unease of Europe on the brink of change. Hercule Poirot, seated at a small breakfast table in the Hotel Miramar at Livorno, lifted the heavy vellum envelope as though it were a rare artifact. The crimson wax seal bore the ornate crest of Count Stefano di Rossi, a name that carried with it centuries of aristocratic weight. Captain Hastings, who had accompanied Poirot on countless ventures and still retained his boyish enthusiasm for romance and mystery, leaned across eagerly. To him the words Monte Cristo conjured visions of sunlit cliffs, pirate treasure, and the adventurous tales of Dumas. He imagined that their journey would be filled with the charm of an exotic retreat, rather than the shadowed complexities of murder. Poirot, however, examined the envelope with his customary precision. He turned it over once, twice, his fingertips tracing the edges of the wax. Not a single detail escaped his eye. The slight unevenness in the seal, the faint smudge of ink at the bottom corner, the particular shade of crimson wax. Only then did he reach for a silver fruit knife, slit the envelope neatly, and unfold the letter within. The note was written in a sloping Italian hand, elegant yet curiously deliberate. Monsieur Hercule Poirot, it is with the greatest honor that I invite you to Villa Ventimiglia, upon the island of Monte Cristo. I have long admired your distinguished career. My household and I would be humbled by your presence. There are matters of delicate import which I wish to place before you, matters concerning both honor and inheritance. I beg that you will accept my hospitality for the coming week. Yours faithfully, Count Stefano di Rossi. Hastings' imagination leapt immediately to the idea of some hidden scandal. Inheritance, Poirot. There is a story in that word alone. Perhaps an old will, perhaps some quarrel between heirs. What do you think? Poirot merely tapped the letter against his saucer, his eyes narrowing. Mon cher Hastings, always you see the drama. Yet it is the small words that matter most. You note how the Count writes, delicate import, not urgent, not dangerous, delicate. And also, observe the ink blotted once. The writer hesitated. What caused him to pause? That, I think, is more suggestive than all your duels and pirates. The captain laughed, accustomed to such remarks. To him, Poirot's capacity to find significance in a smudge or an ink blot was both maddening and reassuring. It meant that nothing, however trivial, escaped the little Belgian's scrutiny. 3 days later, the pair embarked from the port of Livorno, aboard a small chartered vessel bound for Monte Cristo. The sea lay calm and glassy, the horizon a line of silver where sky met water. As the boat cut through the waves, Hastings marveled aloud at the rugged outline of the island rising ahead, sheer cliffs of volcanic stone thrust upward from the sea, crowned with pines that bent and twisted in the coastal winds. White seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries echoing against the rock. From the water, Villa Ventimiglia appeared almost unreal, a pale, sprawling structure perched upon a terrace cut into the cliffside, with shuttered windows catching the light and a staircase of weathered stone descending toward a private cove. Behind the villa loomed a medieval watchtower, half-ruined, a reminder of centuries when pirates had indeed roamed the waters. The Count's servants awaited them at the landing. A broad-shouldered man in livery bowed stiffly and introduced himself as Signor Bellini, the butler. 2 footmen carried their luggage with silent efficiency, while a maid in dark uniform inclined her head respectfully. The atmosphere was formal to the point of severity. Poirot stepped ashore with his usual delicacy, brushing an invisible speck from his immaculate sleeve. His patent leather shoes gleamed absurdly against the rough stone of the quay, yet he seemed perfectly at ease. Hastings followed more energetically, inhaling the salt air with delight. As they ascended the staircase toward the villa, Hastings glanced about him with curiosity. The gardens were terraced with balustrades of marble, heavy urns spilling with geraniums and lavender, yet there was also something stark, almost forbidding about the place. The cliffs fell away so steeply that the sea below seemed a blue abyss, and the shadows of the ruined tower stretched across the lawns like a warning finger. At the threshold of the villa, Count Stefano di Rossi himself awaited his guests. He was a tall man, well into his 60s, with an aquiline nose, silvered hair swept back from a high forehead, and eyes that carried the weary authority of a patriarch. His attire was faultlessly formal. Dark suit, silk cravat, a signet ring flashing upon his finger. He welcomed Poirot with a mixture of deference and relief, as though the detective's arrival were both an honor and a rescue. "Monsieur Poirot," the Count said in fluent, heavily accented French, "it is my profound privilege to greet you. Welcome to Villa Ventimiglia. And you, Captain Hastings, you are most welcome also. Please come within. We have prepared for your comfort." The interior of the villa was as impressive as its facade. High ceilings frescoed with faded cherubs, long corridors lined with portraits of stern ancestors, and vast rooms hung with heavy curtains of crimson velvet. The air smelled faintly of beeswax in the sea. Hastings could not help but be struck by the impression of grandeur tinged with decay, as though the villa itself carried the weight of too many secrets. At luncheon, served in a lofty dining hall where sunlight fell through tall arched windows, the Count introduced several other guests already residing at the villa. Lady Helena Marbury, an English widow of distinguished bearing, sat at the Count's right hand, her pearls gleaming against black silk. To Poirot's left was a young man introduced as Carlo di Rossi, the Count's nephew, whose dark eyes and impatient manner suggested both ambition and dissatisfaction. Across from him sat Signora Biancavalli, an actress of some renown, whose beauty had an edge of theatricality. She laughed too readily and touched her wine-glass with fingers heavy with rings. At the far end of the table lingered a pale, nervous figure, Signor Lucchesi, the Count's personal secretary, who spoke little and seemed always to avoid the Count's gaze. It was a curious gathering, and Hastings, observant though never subtle, could sense tensions beneath the polite exchanges. Lady Helena watched the young nephew with an air of quiet disapproval. The actress Bianca bestowed her smiles too freely, though never in the Count's direction. The secretary Lucchesi twitched each time a servant passed behind him, and the Count himself presided with an air of forced composure, his voice calm but his eyes shadowed. Poirot ate little, yet appeared wholly absorbed in the company, noting each gesture, each hesitation in speech. Once, as the sea wind rattled the shutters, he glanced toward the ruined tower beyond the window and murmured softly, "It is curious, Hastings, how even the stones may remember." The meal concluded. Coffee was served upon a terrace overlooking the cliffs. Far below, the waves crashed endlessly against rock, and the cries of seabirds mingled with the sigh of the wind. The Count lingered close to Poirot, as though seeking the moment to broach some subject. Yet for the time being he held his tongue, offering only gracious remarks upon the beauty of the sea and the endurance of his family's estate. For Hastings, the day had been filled with charm, the setting one of romance and grandeur. But for Poirot, something in the air was unsettled, a vibration too faint for most ears, but unmistakable to his own. as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the ruined tower. He adjusted his cuffs, his eyes gleaming with quiet anticipation. The island of Monte Cristo, for all its beauty, promised more than a holiday. It promised, Poirot thought, the presence of deceit, and perhaps before long, the shadow of death. The following morning dawned pale and luminous, with the sea lying still as glass, its surface broken only by the drifting shadows of gulls. Within Villa Ventimiglia, the atmosphere was hushed, yet charged, as though each inhabitant carried some secret weight. Hercule Poirot, ever immaculate, descended the marble staircase with careful steps, his patent leather shoes clicking upon stone. Hastings followed at a more energetic pace, pausing to admire the frescoes that decorated the walls, faded scenes of myth and conquest, their colors muted by centuries yet retaining a curious vitality. The villa, he thought, was a place of both grandeur and melancholy, where splendor seemed forever shadowed by decay. In the drawing-room the guests had already begun to assemble. Lady Helena Marbury sat erect upon a high-backed chair, her posture as precise as her attire. She wore a gown of dove-gray silk, severe yet elegant, and her long fingers played absently with the clasp of her pearl necklace. Her expression conveyed both dignity and a faint reserve, as though she carried within her an unspoken sorrow. Hastings, watching from a discreet distance, felt that Lady Helena was the sort of woman who had lived through disappointments, yet preserved her composure at any cost. Carlo de Rossi, the Count's nephew, lounged near the window with a careless grace. His youth was evident in the impatience of his movements, the way he tapped the window pane with the fingertip, or drummed a rhythm upon the arm of his chair. His clothes, though well cut, were worn with an air of disregard that suggested not confidence but restlessness. He spoke little, but his eyes roved often toward the sea, toward the guests, toward the Count himself, with an expression that mingled admiration and defiance. The actress, Signora Biancavalli, entered last, her presence commanding the room as though it were a stage. She was tall, her auburn hair arranged in deliberate waves that caught the morning light. Her dress of deep emerald clung in a manner both fashionable and provocative, while her hands, heavy with rings, moved gracefully as she settled into a chaise. She laughed at some small remark from the Count, though no one else had spoken, the sound bright and brittle in the still air. Hastings, though hardly inclined to cynicism, could not help but think the laugh rehearsed. The Count himself remained a figure of quiet authority, yet there was a tension about him more visible in the light of day. His eyes lingered too long upon his guests, his replies measured with the care of a man who weighed each word. He moved with the assurance of habit, but his shoulders were ever so slightly bowed, as though under some unseen burden. The secretary, Lucchesi, passed quietly among them, bearing papers and a silver tray of correspondence. His thin frame and pale complexion gave him an almost spectral quality, and his downcast eyes avoided all but the floor. Yet once, when Lady Helena adjusted her pearls, Hastings noted that the secretary's gaze flickered upward, sharp and swift, before retreating once more. It was a movement so fleeting that most would have missed it entirely, but to Poirot's alert observation it was noted and filed away. The day unfolded in measured fashion. After breakfast the household dispersed across the villa and its grounds. Lady Helena walked among the lavender terraces with a book in her hand, though her eyes seldom fell upon the page. Carlo disappeared toward the cove, his figure cutting a restless path along the rocks. The actress lingered near the ruined tower, her green dress a vivid stroke of color against the ancient stones. Lucchesi retreated to the library, where the scratch of his pen could be heard faintly through the open door. Poirot moved with deliberate leisure, his small figure appearing and vanishing in unexpected places. Upon the terrace, in the gallery, near the watchtower where he paused to adjust a perfectly aligned button. To the casual observer he seemed idle, but Hastings, who knew him too well, recognized the rhythm of a mind already at work. Poirot was watching, always watching. The way Lady Helena's fingers clutched her book too tightly. The way Carlo returned from the cove with damp cuffs. The way Bianca's laughter echoed too loudly against stone walls. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered above the island, lending the sea a darker hue. The villa seemed to retreat into itself, its great windows reflecting the advancing shadow. Within the drawing-room a fire had been lit, though the air remained mild, its flicker casting elongated shapes upon the walls. The guests reassembled with the same careful politeness, yet Hastings felt that beneath the surface each carried some unspoken disquiet. Lady Helena spoke of England, of a house she had once kept in Surrey, her voice calm, but her eyes distant. Carlo remarked upon politics with youthful fervor, only to be silenced by the Count's raised hand. Bianca produced a fan of painted ivory, waving it slowly though the room was not warm, her eyes following the Count with a theatrical attentiveness. Lucchesi remained in the background, pouring wine, his hands trembling ever so slightly. Through it all, Poirot sat serenely, his fingertips pressed together, his gaze moving from one face to another as though arranging pieces upon a chessboard. He asked no questions, yet the silence around him seemed itself an inquiry, drawing out small betrayals of manner and glance. Hastings, less subtle, felt a mounting unease he could not explain. The villa, so majestic in its setting, now seemed to him a stage prepared for some inevitable drama. The guests were not merely companions at leisure, they were players, each concealing a role not yet revealed. And at the center, calm as ever, sat Hercule Poirot, whose little gray cells stirred restlessly beneath the tranquil surface. As night fell and the first drops of rain tapped against the shutters, the gathering dispersed once more. Candles were lit along the corridor, their flames wavering in the draught. Somewhere a door closed with a sound too sharp in the quiet. Hastings paused upon the stair, glancing back toward the drawing-room where Poirot still lingered, his head inclined, his eyes fixed upon the shadows that flickered across the frescoed ceiling. There, in that moment, Hastings understood, though dimly, that the island itself held them in its grasp, that the days ahead would bring not only revelations but danger. For beneath the surface courtesies of Villa Ventimiglia, secrets were already stirring, like the first rumblings of a storm at sea. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the island drenched and gleaming under a pale sun. The air was thick with the scent of pine and salt, the ground still slick with rain. Along the terraces of Villa Ventimiglia, rivulets of water coursed down the steps, catching the light like strands of silver. To Captain Hastings, who stood upon the balcony that morning, the scene was one of freshness, of renewal after darkness. Yet even he felt a lingering heaviness, as though the storm had left behind more than puddles and debris. Poirot emerged from his chamber shortly after breakfast, every detail of his attire immaculate despite the dampness of the air. He moved with careful steps, adjusting his cuffs and smoothing his mustache with a gesture of habitual precision. To the casual eye he seemed absorbed only in the arrangement of his clothing, yet his gaze flicked constantly toward the figures of their fellow guests. The villa, though grand, seemed smaller when its inhabitants gathered within. Lady Helena appeared in the salon with her usual dignity, but her face bore traces of fatigue. The pearls at her throat gleamed as if to remind the world of her station, yet her hand moved to them too often, a reflex betraying unease. Carlo di Rossi was absent until mid-morning. When he entered from the garden with boots muddied and cuffs damp, his expression defiant when questioned by his uncle about his early walk, Signora Bianca Valli, in a gown of crimson that caught every flicker of light, took possession of the drawing-room as though it were a stage. She laughed readily, but her laughter carried a brittle edge, more a performance than an expression of joy. Hastings observed that her eyes seldom lingered upon the Count, though she gave the impression of listening only to him. Instead, her gaze strayed toward the young nephew, with whom she exchanged glances too quickly concealed. The secretary, Lucchesi, moved like a shadow among them. He carried papers for the Count's signature, his head bowed, his hands trembling when he set down the tray of correspondence. He seemed perpetually ill at ease, as though the very walls of the villa pressed too closely upon him. Hastings wondered if the man feared his master, or if some other anxiety gnawed at his composure. By mid-afternoon, the clouds gathered once more, gray masses drifting low over the sea. The guests dispersed about the grounds, each in search of solitude. Hastings accompanied Poirot along the cliff path, where the air struck sharp and briny. The sea below heaved against the rocks, foam sprang upward in sudden bursts. From this vantage point the villa appeared austere, its pale walls stark against the dark sky, while above it the ruined watchtower loomed, its jagged stones like teeth against the horizon. It was upon this path that unease first sharpened into something darker. Lady Helena, encountered near the edge of the cliffs, stood quite still with her book closed in her hands, though her eyes were fixed not upon the page, but upon the sea. She started slightly when addressed, her face momentarily unguarded. In that fleeting expression Hastings glimpsed a weariness beyond sorrow, as though she endured some private struggle unspoken. With composure regained, she moved on, but the impression lingered. Later, Carlo was seen striding along the same path, his movements restless, his eyes scanning the rocks below. He stooped once as if to examine something, then rose quickly when he perceived Hastings observing him. He returned to the villa with quickened step, leaving behind only the print of his boots in the wet earth. Toward evening, as the sky deepened into a violet haze, Signora Bianca appeared near the base of the ruined tower. Her dress, vivid against the stone, fluttered in the rising wind. She looked upward with a dramatic air, as though the ruin were part of some stage set designed for her alone. Yet when she turned and found Poirot watching from a distance, her smile faltered for the briefest instant before returning with exaggerated warmth. The villa itself seemed to reflect the unease of its inhabitants. Doors creaked open with unexplained draughts. Shutters rattled, though no hand touched them, and in the corridors the flickering of candlelight seemed too often to distort the frescoed faces upon the walls. Hastings, not given to superstition, felt none the less that the house harbored some echo of ancient unrest. That evening, dinner was served in greater silence than before. The Count presided with his habitual dignity, though his gaze often drifted to the nephew, whose impatience grew ever more evident. Lady Helena touched little of her food, and Bianca's laughter rang hollow, a performance too polished. Lucchese, pale and withdrawn, spilled a few drops of wine upon the linen and paled further when the Count's glance fell upon him. Outside, the storm broke again. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rumbled across the sea, and lightning revealed the stark silhouette of the ruined tower. Hastings, glancing from face to face, thought that each guest appeared caught within that illumination, like figures in some grim tableau. Poirot sat with hands folded, his head inclined, his eyes half closed as though listening to a melody inaudible to others. To Hastings it seemed his friend was waiting for the inevitable discord that must arise when too many secrets pressed upon a single household. As the thunder rolled and the candles guttered, Hastings felt a chill that was not of the storm. Shadows lengthened across the walls, and within them lurked the promise of darker revelations yet to come. The island of Monte Cristo, so proud and ancient, had already begun to whisper of tragedy. The storm raged long into the night, its fury shaking the shutters of Villa Ventimiglia and filling the corridors with the roar of sea and sky. Within, the household gathered uneasily after dinner, drawn together more by necessity than companionship. The great drawing-room, lit by candles and the occasional flare of lightning, seemed at once magnificent and oppressive. Heavy curtains swayed with each draught, shadows leapt and twisted across frescoed walls, and the portraits of grim ancestors gazed down as if in judgment. Count Stefano di Rossi presided with outward composure, yet his manner betrayed an undercurrent of unease. His words were measured, his gestures precise, but his gaze moved constantly among his guests, as though wary of what he might find in their eyes. Lady Helena sat apart, her book unopened upon her lap, her features set in grave reflection. Carlo, restless, paced the room with a frown that deepened each time his uncle spoke. Bianca Valli, radiant in crimson silk, reclined upon a chaise, her laughter rising too brightly above the storm, while Lucchese hovered at the edges, pale and watchful, like a servant too conscious of secrets not meant for him to bear. Poirot occupied an armchair near the fire, his small frame composed, his eyes half closed as though he dozed. Yet Hastings knew him too well to be deceived. Beneath that serenity lay observation sharp as a blade. Poirot's gaze flicked now and again to the Count, and once he murmured almost inaudibly, "It is midnight that reveals mon ami." Always at midnight. The evening dragged with an air of expectancy. At last the Count rose, announcing that he must attend to correspondence in his study before retiring. His tone was courteous, but there was finality in his words. He bowed to Lady Helena, bestowed a brief nod upon Bianca, and withdrew, Lucchese following with a sheaf of papers. The sound of the study door closing echoed through the corridor like the tolling of a bell. One by one the others dispersed. Lady Helena retired early, her figure tall and austere as she mounted the staircase. Carlo muttered something indistinct before disappearing toward his chamber, his steps heavy and impatient. Bianca lingered longest, her smile curving as though she relished the tension in the air, before finally retreating with a flourish of her gown. Hastings, weary, withdrew as well, though not before noting Poirot's intent gaze upon the closed study door. The villa fell into uneasy silence, broken only by the ceaseless storm. Rain battered against stone, shutters rattled, and the wind moaned like some restless spirit. In his room, Hastings tossed upon his bed, unable to sleep. The air felt charged, as though the house itself held its breath. At length he drifted into troubled slumber, only to be awakened by a sound so sudden and sharp that it set his heart pounding. A single cry, muffled and brief, as though smothered by walls. Then silence. Moments later, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Doors opened, voices whispered. A maid, pale and trembling, knocked upon Poirot's chamber. Within minutes the villa stirred with alarm. Guests roused from sleep, servants hurrying with candles that guttered in the draught. The cry had come, it was said, from the Count's study. They gathered before the locked door, Poirot calm and precise, Hastings anxious, Lady Helena grave, Carlo pale with agitation, Bianca clutching her shawl theatrically, Lucchese trembling so violently that the candle he held nearly toppled. The heavy oak door was bolted from within. No sound issued from beyond. At Poirot's direction the butler fetched a key, but it availed nothing. The bolt inside had been drawn. With effort the door was forced open, the panel splintering under the weight of shoulders. The study lay revealed, lit only by the last flicker of a candle burned almost to its base. Count Stefano di Rossi sat slumped at his desk, his head fallen forward upon scattered papers. His face was ashen, his eyes half open, his cravat stained with a dark wound. Beside him lay a dagger of antique design, its hilt worked in silver, its blade glistening crimson. The windows were shut and barred, the curtains drawn. The single door, until now locked and bolted, was the only entrance. A cry escaped from Bianca's lips, sharp and shrill, before she pressed her hand to her mouth. Lady Helena turned away, her shoulders rigid. Carlo rushed forward, only to be restrained by Poirot, who raised a hand of command. Poirot stepped nearer, his gaze sweeping the room with the precision of a surgeon. The scene bore every mark of the impossible. The Count dead, the weapon present, the room secured from within. Papers lay scattered across the desk as though seized in haste. A candle guttered low, its wax pooling unevenly. Upon the carpet, faint but visible, was a smear of salt as though sea spray had been carried where it had no place. Poirot bent close, his mustaches quivering. He touched nothing, yet noted all. The angle of the dagger, The position of the chair, the overturned inkstand, the way the flame of the candle leaned as though disturbed by a draught that should not exist. At last he straightened, turning to those assembled. His voice, though quiet, carried across the room. "Messieurs, mesdames, the Count is dead. And yet," observed, "the door was locked, the windows barred, the room sealed. Tell me, then, how has the hand of death entered here?" The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the groan of the storm outside. Faces turned pale, eyes shifted, hands trembled. It was not merely murder that confronted them. It was the impossible. Poirot folded his arms, his eyes glinting in the candlelight. "It is here, mes amis, that we must employ the little grey cells. For though the storm rages without, it is within these walls that a darker storm now begins." The household of Villa Ventimiglia woke the following morning to a silence more oppressive than the storm of the night before. Heavy curtains had been drawn against the pale sunlight, and the villa seemed to breathe with unease, each corridor echoing too loudly, each chamber weighted with dread. The death of Count Stefano di Rossi had transformed the stately retreat into a prison, its inhabitants bound together by suspicion. Hercule Poirot had risen early, immaculately dressed, his patent shoes gleaming, his tie knotted with care. The small man moved through the villa with measured steps, pausing often to examine details that others overlooked: a damp mark upon the stair, a smear upon the carpet, a half-burned candle left upon a mantel. Hastings, who followed, observed the process with mingled admiration and bewilderment, never certain which of these details held significance. The Count's study remained sealed, guarded by the butler Bellini under Poirot's instructions. Within, the body lay undisturbed until officials could be summoned from the mainland, but Poirot would permit no interference before his own examination was complete. For the moment, the room was a chamber of silence, its secrets still intact. Breakfast was a strained affair. The guests assembled with reluctance, their faces pale, their movements subdued. Lady Helena sat stiffly, her eyes shadowed, her cup untouched before her. Biancavalli, though resplendent in a gown of sapphire silk, carried an air of nervous agitation, her usual laughter absent. Carlo appeared restless, his hands drumming upon the table until Poirot's calm gaze stilled him. Lucchesi, the secretary, trembled visibly as he poured coffee, spilling a few drops upon the linen and blanching at the sight. Poirot cleared his throat delicately. His words were calm, almost conversational, yet they carried the weight of command. "It is necessary, mes amis, that we understand what has passed. Each of you will give an account of your movements last night, that we may see how the pattern is formed." Lady Helena spoke first. Her voice was steady, though tinged with weariness. She had retired early, she explained, to her chamber with a book. The storm had disturbed her sleep, yet she had not left her room until summoned after midnight. Hastings noted how her hand never strayed far from the pearls at her throat, as though they alone preserved her composure. Carlo's account was less composed. He admitted freely to pacing the corridors in restlessness, unable to sleep, the storm unsettling him. He had paused upon the landing, heard footsteps he could not place, then returned to his chamber before the cry had awakened them all. His eyes, dark with defiance, seemed to challenge Poirot to doubt him. Biancavalli's testimony was colored with drama. She had retired later than the others, unable to resist the fascination of the storm. She confessed to lingering at her mirror, brushing her hair, when she heard the cry that shattered the night. Her voice trembled as she described it, her hands gesturing with theatrical intensity. Yet Poirot's eyes, half closed, revealed nothing. Lucchesi stammered through his account, his words halting. He had attended the Count in the study, bringing papers for signature, then withdrawn at the Count's command. He had returned to his own small chamber, not far from the library, and there remained until summoned by the commotion. His hands shook so violently as he spoke that his teacup rattled against its saucer. Each account seemed plausible, yet each carried threads of doubt. Poirot listened with polite attentiveness, offering no judgment. Only once did he remark, quietly, It is curious, is it not, how in times of storm the house itself bears witness. Footsteps are muffled, cries are lost, yet the little details remain. The day was devoted to examination. Poirot entered the study once more, Hastings at his side. The room lay as it had been found. The Count slumped at the desk, the dagger embedded, the candle guttered. Poirot's gaze swept over the details with meticulous care. He noted the smudge of salt upon the carpet, where no sea spray should reach. He observed the scattered papers, some torn, some blotted. He examined the bolt of the door, sturdy and unbroken, the shutters of the windows, fastened securely. Hastings voiced what many must have thought. "It's impossible, Poirot. No one could have entered or left. It must have been suicide." Poirot's mustaches bristled. "Suicide, mon ami, is the explanation of the man who will not think. The dagger? Too deliberate. The posture? Too arranged. And consider, the bolt was drawn, yes, but from which side? These things must be weighed one by one." The afternoon brought further revelations. Poirot discovered within a drawer of the desk a letter half burned, its edges crumbled to ash. What remained hinted at words of accusation, though the name was destroyed. He lifted the fragment delicately, murmuring, "The Count wished to burn this," but he was interrupted at the moment when words most dangerous might be preserved. Later in the corridor, Poirot stooped to examine a mark upon the flagstones, faint, almost invisible, yet distinct to his keen eye. It was the imprint of a shoe, damp and smudged, leading not toward the study, but away, into the shadows of the library passage. He did not speak of it, merely filed it within the order of his thoughts. By evening the villa lay under a heavy stillness. The sea had calmed, the sky cleared, yet within the walls tension deepened. The guests avoided one another, their conversations brief, their glances wary. Servants moved quietly, as though fearful of breaking some fragile thread of order. Poirot, seated in the drawing-room with Hastings, tapped his fingertips together. "It is always the same, mon ami. A murder brings with it not only the death of a man, but the birth of lies. Already we have the lies. Soon we shall have the truth." Hastings, though comforted by Poirot's confidence, could not banish a sense of unease. The villa seemed alive with whispers, the corridors heavy with secrets, and in his heart he knew that the storm had not passed. It had only begun. The day following the Count's death broke clear and bright, as though nature sought to deny the shadows within Villa Ventimiglia. Sunlight streamed across the marble floors. The sea glistened in 1,000 points of silver, and the fragrance of pine drifted through open shutters. Yet for all this outward beauty, the villa itself seemed steeped in unease. Its inhabitants moved with hushed caution, their voices subdued, their glances weighted with suspicion. Poirot stepped nearer, his gaze sweeping the room with the precision of a surgeon. The scene bore every mark of the impossible. The Count dead, the weapon present, the room secured from within. Papers lay scattered across the desk as though seized in haste. A candle guttered low, its wax pooling unevenly. Upon the carpet, faint but visible, was a smear of salt as though sea spray had been carried where it had no place. Poirot bent close, his mustaches quivering. He touched nothing, yet noted all. The angle of the dagger, the position of the chair, the overturned inkstand, the way the flame of the candle leaned as though disturbed by a draught that should not exist. At last he straightened, turning to those assembled. His voice, though quiet, carried across the room. "Messieurs, mesdames, the Count is dead. And yet, observe, the door was locked, the windows barred, the room sealed. Tell me, then, how has the hand of death entered here?" The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the groan of the storm outside. Faces turned pale, eyes shifted, hands trembled. It was not merely murder that confronted them. It was the impossible. Poirot folded his arms, his eyes glinting in the candlelight. "It is here, mes amis, that we must employ the little grey cells. For though the storm rages without, it is within these walls that a darker storm now begins." The household of Villa Ventimiglia woke the following morning to a silence more oppressive than the storm of the night before. Heavy curtains had been drawn against the pale sunlight, and the villa seemed to breathe with unease, each corridor echoing too loudly, each chamber weighted with dread. The death of Count Stefano di Rossi had transformed the stately retreat into a prison, its inhabitants bound together by suspicion. Hercule Poirot had risen early, immaculately dressed, his patent shoes gleaming, his tie knotted with care. The small man moved through the villa with measured steps, pausing often to examine details that others overlooked: a damp mark upon the stair, a smear upon the carpet, a half-burned candle left upon a mantel. Hastings, who followed, observed the process with mingled admiration and bewilderment, never certain which of these details held significance. The Count's study remained sealed, guarded by the butler Bellini under Poirot's instructions. Within, the body lay undisturbed until officials could be summoned from the mainland, but Poirot would permit no interference before his own examination was complete. For the moment, the room was a chamber of silence, its secrets still intact. Breakfast was a strained affair. The guests assembled with reluctance, their faces pale, their movements subdued. Lady Helena sat stiffly, her eyes shadowed, her cup untouched before her. Biancavalli, though resplendent in a gown of sapphire silk, carried an air of nervous agitation, her usual laughter absent. Carlo appeared restless, his hands drumming upon the table until Poirot's calm gaze stilled him. Lucchesi, the secretary, trembled visibly as he poured coffee, spilling a few drops upon the linen and blanching at the sight. Poirot cleared his throat delicately. His words were calm, almost conversational, yet they carried the weight of command. "It is necessary, mes amis, that we understand what has passed. Each of you will give an account of your movements last night, that we may see how the pattern is formed." Lady Helena spoke first. Her voice was steady, though tinged with weariness. She had retired early, she explained, to her chamber with a book. The storm had disturbed her sleep, yet she had not left her room until summoned after midnight. Hastings noted how her hand never strayed far from the pearls at her throat, as though they alone preserved her composure. Carlo's account was less composed. He admitted freely to pacing the corridors in restlessness, unable to sleep, the storm unsettling him. He had paused upon the landing, heard footsteps he could not place, then returned to his chamber before the cry had awakened them all. His eyes, dark with defiance, seemed to challenge Poirot to doubt him. Biancavalli's testimony was colored with drama. She had retired later than the others, unable to resist the fascination of the storm. She confessed to lingering at her mirror, brushing her hair, when she heard the cry that shattered the night. Her voice trembled as she described it, her hands gesturing with theatrical intensity. Yet Poirot's eyes, half closed, revealed nothing. Lucchesi stammered through his account, his words halting. He had attended the Count in the study, bringing papers for signature, then withdrawn at the Count's command. He had returned to his own small chamber, not far from the library, and there remained until summoned by the commotion. His hands shook so violently as he spoke that his teacup rattled against its saucer. Each account seemed plausible, yet each carried threads of doubt. Poirot listened with polite attentiveness, offering no judgment. Only once did he remark, quietly, "It is curious, is it not, how in times of storm the house itself bears witness. Footsteps are muffled, cries are lost, yet the little details remain." The day was devoted to examination. Poirot entered the study once more, Hastings at his side. The room lay as it had been found. The Count slumped at the desk, the dagger embedded, the candle guttered. Poirot's gaze swept over the details with meticulous care. He noted the smudge of salt upon the carpet, where no sea spray should reach. He observed the scattered papers, some torn, some blotted. He examined the bolt of the door, sturdy and unbroken, the shutters of the windows, fastened securely. Hastings voiced what many must have thought. "It's impossible, Poirot. No one could have entered or left. It must have been suicide." Poirot's mustaches bristled. Suicide, mon ami, is the explanation of the man who will not think. The dagger? Too deliberate. The posture? Too arranged. And consider, the bolt was drawn, yes, but from which side? These things must be weighed one by one. The afternoon brought further revelations. Poirot discovered within a drawer of the desk a letter half-burned, its edges crumbled to ash. What remained hinted at words of accusation, though the name was destroyed. He lifted the fragment delicately, murmuring, "The Count wished to burn this," but he was interrupted. Interrupted at the moment when words most dangerous might be preserved. Later in the corridor, Poirot stooped to examine a mark upon the flagstones, faint, almost invisible, yet distinct to his keen eye. It was the imprint of a shoe, damp and smudged, leading not toward the study, but away, into the shadows of the library passage. He did not speak of it, merely filed it within the order of his thoughts. By evening the villa lay under a heavy stillness. The sea had calmed, the sky cleared, yet within the walls tension deepened. The guests avoided one another, their conversations brief, their glances wary. Servants moved quietly, as though fearful of breaking some fragile thread of order. Poirot, seated in the drawing-room with Hastings, tapped his fingertips together. "It is always the same, mon ami. A murder brings with it not only the death of a man, but the birth of lies. Already we have the lies. Soon we shall have the truth." Hastings, though comforted by Poirot's confidence, could not banish a sense of unease. The villa seemed alive with whispers, the corridors heavy with secrets, and in his heart he knew that the storm had not passed. It had only begun. The day following the Count's death broke clear and bright, as though nature sought to deny the shadows within Villa Ventimiglia. Sunlight streamed across the marble floors. The sea glistened in 1,000 points of silver, and the fragrance of pine drifted through open shutters. Yet for all this outward beauty, the villa itself seemed steeped in unease. Its inhabitants moved with hushed caution, their voices subdued, their glances weighted with suspicion. Poirot began his inquiries with quiet persistence. He asked no direct accusations, but in his soft manner drew from each guest more than they wished to reveal. Hastings observed that his friend's method was less interrogation than observation. Poirot listened not only to words but to silences, noted gestures as carefully as he did facts. It was in those silences that truth began to glimmer. Lady Helena remained poised, her gray gown as severe as her bearing, but beneath that composure, Poirot detected the faint tremor of strain. In the morning-room she admitted, almost reluctantly, that she had known the Count years earlier in England, before his marriage. They had been friends, nothing more, but she spoke with an air of unfinished sentences, as though old affections or regrets remained unvoiced. When Poirot inquired gently whether she had ever corresponded with him in recent years, she pressed her lips and replied that such matters were private. Hastings thought she had said too much or too little. Carlo de Rossi grew increasingly restless under scrutiny. He roamed the grounds like a caged animal, his dark eyes flashing when servants crossed his path. Poirot, meeting him upon the terrace, remarked upon his late uncle's authority within the family. Carlo shrugged with defiance, speaking of modern ideas, of youth demanding its inheritance, its place in the world. There was bitterness in his words, and when asked whether he stood to benefit from the Count's passing, he answered too quickly, as though the thought had already crossed his mind. Biancavalli. The actress was less guarded, but no less deceptive. She adorned her speech with flourishes, insisting upon her devotion to the Count as a patron of the arts. Yet her glances told another story. Poirot, ever attentive, observed how her eyes strayed toward Carlo with a familiarity too easily masked by theatricality. Hastings, romantic at heart, suspected some entanglement. Poirot, less sentimental, considered what advantage might be gained by attachment to a young heir rather than to an aging benefactor. Lucchesi, the secretary, proved most pitiable. His hands shook when he presented documents to Poirot, his eyes darting as though fearing reproach. At last, under gentle pressure, he confessed that the Count had intended to alter his will. He had drafted a new document at his master's command, one that favored certain beneficiaries at the expense of others. He would not say whose names were written, for the draft had vanished during the night. Yet his distress seemed genuine, and Poirot's gaze softened even as he noted the omission. By afternoon, whispers ran like currents through the villa. Servants murmured of quarrels overheard, of doors closed too hastily, of midnight footsteps echoing along the stone corridors. Hastings, wandering near the library, overheard two maids speaking of a woman's voice, raised in anger, late upon the night of the storm. When he inquired further, they fell silent, eyes wide, and retreated in haste. Poirot, meanwhile, had discovered something curious in the Count's study. Beneath the desk lay a fragment of paper, charred at the edges, overlooked in the earlier search. Upon it remained a single phrase: "The truth will destroy you." Nothing more, yet enough to suggest blackmail or threat. Poirot examined it gravely, remarking to Hastings that words once written, however fragmentary, seldom lied. As evening approached, the villa gathered once more in the drawing-room. The storm had passed, but tension remained heavy as the air before lightning. Lady Helena sat rigidly. Carlo paced with visible impatience. Bianca reclined in languid display. Lucchese hovered pale and silent. Poirot regarded them with the serenity of a chess master awaiting the moment to move his final piece. He spoke only once, his voice quiet yet commanding. "There is among us a truth that has not yet been spoken, but already, mes amis, the pattern begins to show itself. The dagger, the locked room, the letter half burned, all are pieces. Soon they will form the whole." His words fell into the silence like stones into water, sending ripples across each face. Lady Helena's hand tightened upon her pearls. Carlo turned sharply, his brows drawn. Bianca's smile faltered, and Lucchese's pallor deepened until he seemed almost translucent. The hour was late when Hastings retired, yet sleep came slowly. Through the shuttered window he heard the sigh of the sea and the cry of a night-bird. In his mind he saw again the faces of the villa's guests, each shadowed by fear or guilt, each concealing more than they revealed. He could not guess what Poirot had discerned, but he knew that his friend's little gray cells were at work, assembling fragments into revelation, and somewhere in that vast, silent house, a murderer lay awake also, watching the darkness with eyes that concealed the weight of their crime. The air within Villa Ventimiglia seemed charged on the evening that Poirot summoned all to the grand salon. The great chamber, with its vaulted ceiling and somber portraits, had an aspect almost ecclesiastical, as though it were a place of judgment. Outside, twilight deepened over the sea, casting long shadows through the tall windows. The ruined tower stood stark against a fading sky, its silhouette a reminder of centuries of watchfulness. Within, the flicker of candles set faces into sharp relief, each guest illuminated and betrayed by the trembling light. Poirot had chosen his setting with care. A small armchair, placed deliberately at the center, became his pulpit. Around him the guests were arranged as though upon a stage. Lady Helena upright and grave, her hands folded in her lap. Carlo restless, his body taut as if ready to spring. Bianca Valli languid upon a chaise, her fan moving idly though the air was cool. Lucchese pale and hunched, his gaze fixed upon the floor. Hastings lingered at the edge, keenly observant, struck once again by how Poirot could turn a simple gathering into a tribunal. The little Belgian began with gentleness, his voice scarcely more than a murmur, yet commanding all attention. He spoke of the Count, of his household, of the complexities that attend wealth and inheritance. He reminded them of the dagger, the bolted door, the candle burned low, the letter half destroyed. He laid each piece upon the table of their minds, until the impossible once again confronted them. Then, slowly, Poirot began to unpick the lies. Lady Helena's composure was tested first. With delicate courtesy, Poirot observed that her friendship with the Count had been of longer standing than she admitted. He spoke of letters exchanged, of confidences once shared, of a past never wholly relinquished. Her lips tightened, and she confessed that she had indeed been close to him, but insisted her regard was innocent. Yet the flicker in her eyes betrayed knowledge of secrets that had long lain dormant. Next came Carlo. Poirot described his restlessness, his ambition, his impatience to inherit. He reminded all that Carlo had been seen wandering the corridors, his boots damp with sea spray. The young man flushed, protesting that he had sought only the solace of the cliffs. Yet his very vehemence rang hollow, and more than one glance turned toward him with suspicion. Biancavalli was addressed with even greater delicacy. Poirot observed how affection can be a mask for advantage, how admiration for art may conceal calculations more worldly. He alluded to her closeness with Carlo, to glances exchanged when they thought themselves unobserved. She laughed, a brittle sound, and declared that actors live always in the realm of illusion. But her hand trembled upon her fan, and her eyes, usually bold, flickered uneasily toward the nephew. Lucchese, poor trembling Lucchese, was confronted last. Poirot spoke of the will that had been drafted, of the missing pages, of the secretary's knowledge too dangerous to possess. The man's face drained of color. His stammered protest was scarcely audible. Yet Poirot, with a small nod, declared that Lucchese, though weak, was not the hand that had struck the blow. His fear was of knowledge, not of guilt. The silence grew heavy, broken only by the distant boom of waves upon the cliffs. Poirot sat back, his eyes half closed, his fingertips pressed together. At last he spoke the words that shifted the air in the room. The locked door, mes amis, is but an illusion. It was not the Count who secured it, but the murderer. A hand reached from without, a device employed, simple yet clever, to draw the bolt. And consider the smudge of salt upon the carpet. Who but one fresh from the sea path could have left such a trace? The cufflink so carelessly planted. Ah, that is the vanity of the guilty. Always they seek to mislead, and in so doing reveal themselves. His gaze moved slowly across the assembled faces, pausing upon each. Lady Helena bowed her head. Her sorrow deepened, but her innocence clear. Carlo shifted, his hands clenched, yet his confusion betrayed more passion than malice. Bianca's smile faltered, her composure crumbling. Lucchese sat hunched, waiting for reprieve. Poirot rose at last, his small figure erect, his eyes bright with triumph. It is here, mes amis, that the pattern completes itself. The dagger, the letter, the bolt, the salt, each by itself, nothing. Together they tell the tale. The murderer is among us, and it is one whose ambition outweighed both loyalty and gratitude. The hand that struck the Count belonged not to the heir, nor to the lady, nor to the poor secretary. None. It belonged to the one who thought himself cleverer than the little gray cells. He turned, his finger lifting, his voice sharp as steel. The murderer is Signor Lucchese, secretary to the Count. For who else had knowledge of the will, access to the study, and opportunity to prepare the trick of the bolt? It was Lucchese who lingered with papers, who returned unseen, who staged the scene of impossibility. The smudge of salt was his undoing. He sought to suggest another's presence, but left instead the mark of his own guilt. A gasp filled the chamber. Lucchese rose, his face waxen, his lips trembling. His denial, thin and broken, faltered beneath the weight of evidence. Poirot's gaze remained steady, his voice calm. The truth, mon pauvre, is inevitable. It is not the storm that betrays, but the stillness after. You thought the locked door a fortress, but it was only a mask. And masks, you see, are always removed. The room held its breath as the secretary sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face. The others sat in stunned silence, each absorbing the revelation in their own manner. Relief, sorrow, shock. Hastings, though long accustomed to Poirot's brilliance, felt once again the awe of seeing disorder shaped into clarity. Poirot, folding his arms, looked upon them all with quiet gravity. Justice, mes amis, is not a thing to be hurried, but it arrives always. And now, it has arrived. The night that followed Poirot's revelation seemed endless within the walls of Villa Ventimiglia. Servants whispered in the corridors, guests retired to their rooms in silence, and the sound of the sea below carried an unfamiliar note, less the roar of a storm than the ceaseless sigh of a witness who had seen too much. Lucchesi, the secretary, was placed under guard until officials from the mainland could arrive. He made no further protest. His face remained hidden in his hands, his frail figure hunched as though the very weight of truth had crushed him. From time to time a low murmur escaped his lips, a mixture of despair and self-reproach, but never again did he attempt denial. The dawn came clear and radiant, the horizon painted with hues of gold and rose. Hastings stood with Poirot upon the terrace, gazing out across the vast sweep of sea. The cliffs, dark and forbidding by night, now glowed with the gentler light of morning. The ruined tower, silhouetted against the sky, seemed less a sentinel of menace than a relic softened by time. Yet the villa itself remained solemn, its grandeur stained by memory of the crime. Poirot was calm, his small figure precise as ever, his moustaches immaculate, his eyes contemplative. He spoke not of triumph, but of inevitability. It is always so, mon ami. The human heart. It thinks it may conceal. It thinks the lie will suffice. But there is always some small detail that betrays. The cuff-link placed too carefully, the salt smudge that whispers of deceit, the bolt drawn by a hand too hasty. In the end, the little gray cells see what pride has overlooked. Hastings, though filled with admiration, felt a weight of sorrow. He thought of the Count, dignified even in death, of Lady Helena's quiet grief, of Carlo's restless ambition, of Bianca's laughter now silenced. Each had been touched by the tragedy, each left to reckon with its shadows. "It seems a waste," he murmured, "that such beauty and such heritage should be darkened by greed." Poirot inclined his head. "Greed, yes. Vanity also." The secretary wished not only security but power. He saw himself as master, yet he was always servant. In his presumption lay his downfall. By mid-morning, a launch from the mainland approached, bearing the authorities. The sound of its engine broke the stillness, a reminder that the world beyond the island had not ceased to turn. The officials would take statements, examine the evidence, and remove the prisoner. Yet for those who remained, justice had already been served. Lady Helena, when she descended to the salon, carried herself with quiet dignity. She spoke little, but her eyes met Poirot's with a gratitude unspoken. Carlo, pale and subdued, no longer displayed defiance. He seemed instead chastened, sobered by how near suspicion had brushed him. Bianca Valli, though outwardly composed, betrayed through restless gestures her relief at being spared greater scrutiny. When at last Lucchesi was led away, his figure bent, his step faltering, a hush fell over the villa. None exulted, none condemned. There was only the solemn acknowledgment of truth. The sea wind stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of lavender and salt, as though cleansing the air. Poirot, standing once more upon the terrace, regarded the horizon. "It is finished," he said softly. "The island may rest again." Hastings felt a curious peace settle over him. The shadows had not been banished, but they had been named. Justice, in its quiet way, had prevailed, and as the sun lifted higher, gilding the ruins and the waves alike, he knew that the memory of Monte Cristo would remain with him always, not as an adventure of romance, but as a reminder of the delicate balance between deception and truth. Thank you for joining us on this journey to Monte Cristo. If you enjoyed this Hercule Poirot mystery, do subscribe for more stories every day. Your support keeps these tales alive and helps us bring new mysteries to light. Until we meet again, may your nights be peaceful, your mind curious, and your heart at ease. Good night and sleep well.